And today is the 97th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And we've been here every Tuesday and Thursday about this time, where we've been examining a topic that is an issue in the world of security. And the idea of thought leadership is not to try and solve the world's problems with all the solutions, but coming up with ideas. What's the thinking and where is it going? And today our topic is managing the impact of suicide, colleagues, clients and society. And here I've been greatly guided by my colleague Josephine Ram, who's our researcher in this topic. And we've been very thoughtful about the fact that people on the front line in security may experience or be impacted by suicide in different ways. And so might those who manage those who are on the front line. And it's a topic of big importance to the security sector. So today we've got 4 panelists who are going to be giving their views on this. As you know, the idea is they each introduce themselves. And once they've done that, we'll ask them for their opening statements, 3 minutes when they get the chance to say what they think about the topic. Once they've done that, we'll come to you, the audience, and invite you to ask questions using your question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. And first of all, let's go to Tim. Tim, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me. I'm Tim Woodhouse. I lead the suicide prevention programme in Kent and Medway, which is an area in the southeast of England, population about 1.8 million, working with a load of different charities and health bodies across the patch.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Over to the United States and Doreen.
Hello, I'm Doreen Marshall. I'm the Vice President of Mission Engagement at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'm a psychologist by training, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in the United States is the largest private nonprofit funding suicide prevention research and doing community work.
Thank you very much, Doreen. And then back to the United Kingdom and Patrick.
Hi, my name is Patrick Ray. I'm a trustee of PTSD Resolution. We're a charity that provides mental health therapy for armed forces, veterans, reservists and their families. And we work very closely with the security industry because of all of those employed in the security industry subsequently. And we work with other companies and organizations in the sector too. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Sharon.
Hi, my name's Sharon McDonald. I'm the Managing Director of Suicide Bereavement UK. I also have an honorary research fellowship with the University of Manchester, and I specialise in suicide bereavement research, training and consultancy.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, once again, an expert panel. We're going to ask them now for their opening statements, up to 3 minutes when they get the chance to say what they think the issues are in this subject matter. Don't forget, questions on the question and answer panel at the bottom of your screen. I'll endeavour to get to you, to involve you. Do get your questions in early though, please, so that I can make sure I involve you. Okay, without further ado, let's go back to Tim. And Tim, your opening statement, please.
Thanks, Martin. I suppose because I'm going first, I should just point out that, and it goes without saying, of course, but suicide, whenever we talk about suicide, it is a very sensitive conversation, a very sensitive subject. I'm sure there are many people on the panel in the audience who have lost loved ones to suicide, may have experienced suicidality themselves. So please look after yourselves. Please take care while listening to this conversation, and seek help if you need it. Very quickly from me, I suppose that why have we been invited to a security webinar to talk about this issue? And I guess there's 2 main reasons. One, because we know that the workforce is mainly, or very high proportion of middle-aged men who we know are at greatest risk of suicide in terms of sheer numbers. We also know that the security industry will be working on sites in shopping centres, in car parks, which sadly do attract people that may want to end their own life. So a number of different factors going on why it's a relevant subject to you. I suppose I wanted to kind of touch on 3 key points, I suppose, in terms of my opening remarks, in terms of what can make a difference. My first feeling is training. Train your staff, train your managers, train your workforce. And it doesn't need to be in-depth. There are lots of different training products out there. Find one that works for your companies. There's 20-minute online training available, certainly in England, which is a fantastic resource from the Zero Suicide Alliance. And it just gives people the confidence to ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? And actually, that is probably the #1 message that it would be great for people to take home today. Do not be frightened to ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? Because once you know the answer to that, you can start putting interventions and safety plans into place. The second point I would say is actually prepare yourself for whatever comes back. If somebody says to you, yes, actually, I am feeling suicidal, know somewhere that you can signpost them onto. So make sure that there's always support available, either for your staff or amongst the public that you come in contact with. Is there a phone line? Is there a helpline? Is there a website that you can always refer them onto so they can get help anytime, day or night? And then finally, my third point would just be, let's be brave. As a society, let's embrace technology. It's got lots of downsides, but is there a technological solution to some of this? Are there some building sites, are there shopping malls, are there car parks where actually we can start introducing technology to track people's phones and actually see if they can alert us to suicidal behavior before it happens? And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Very, very interesting, Tim. Some interesting points, and I'm sure we're going to come back on those. Let's move to Doreen then. Doreen, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. To echo Tim's great statement, I would say that, we're learning so much more about suicide every day from research. And what we understand about suicide is that it's very often connected to one's mental health. So the factors that lead someone to die by suicide are often driven by a mental health distress or deteriorating mental health. So a lot of the work that we do is also about kind of early detection, thinking about how can we notice when someone is struggling with their mental health and intervene accordingly. And in the workplace, we know, at least in the United States, that 80% of all of our suicides annually, and that's about 48,000 a year here, are adults between the ages of 18 and 65, which is really the workforce. So the vast majority of people we are losing are working aged adults. And so that, to me, is a call to action for us to really think about, particularly in workplaces, what can we do? And a lot of our work is really around supporting a culture of care, very much what Tim said, around making it okay to ask, making it okay for people to voice their distress. And the very nature of what we know when someone struggles with suicidal thoughts or suicidal feelings, it's a very isolating syndrome for them. Meaning that if you're someone who notices someone struggling, reaching out and asking is actually not only the right thing to do, but it actually breaks that isolation for the person. And most people who are asked, who are feeling suicidal, they meet that question with relief. Someone has noticed my pain. And so, if I could empower those listening today, is to really be part of the solution. If you're worried about someone, to not wait, to not think it's someone else's responsibility, because we know we all have a role to play in suicide prevention. And the last thing I'll say is that in any given group, we know that there are people who are thinking about suicide in a given moment, who have been impacted by suicide loss in their life, or who may be supporting a loved one who is struggling with suicidal ideation. So I say that meaning that in every workplace, in every group, there are folks that are dealing with this actively. And so the more we can get ahead of it with good policies, good procedures, and really being proactive, the better we're going to do to prevent suicide.
Thank you very much indeed. Don't forget, if you want to get your question in as soon as you can, question and answer button at the bottom of your screen will endeavour to involve you. Let's go over to Patrick. Patrick, your opening statement, please.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And great points, Tim and Doreen. Thank you. Trauma and PTSD can lead to family breakdown, addiction and suicide. Yet in our industry, 40% of security staff surveyed exhibit symptoms of PTSD. That's according to Professor Mark Button, Professor of Criminology at the Institute of Criminal Research Studies at the University of Portsmouth. He says it leaves a very clear message that the issue of mental health is not currently being taken seriously by security managers. Well, PTSD Resolutions is a Forces Veterans charity that provides therapy free of charge for trauma through a network of 200 therapists, and actually now very successfully during lockdown via telephone and internet. We started to work closely with the security industry, as I mentioned just briefly earlier, because of the high number of veterans and reservists. working in the sector, some sadly still with mental health issues from their time in the services. We also provide trauma awareness training for industry sector line managers and HR people too, so they can identify a member of their team that might be struggling with mental health issues. We're one of the only providers of trauma therapy that also treats those suffering from addiction issues or are in prison too. And one of the few providers to report on the results of treatment. And I would just wanted to mention those briefly, so people know that there is help available, effective help. PTSD resolution, we've had 3,000 referrals to date, and in 78% of those cases, that's nearly 8 out of 10, there was a resolution to where the clients and the therapists agreed that no further treatment was required. And that's after an average of 6 outpatient sessions. So just finally, just to leave you with some key points before we go on and into the Q&A, what employers, I would say, need to know is this, that trauma certainly is a major issue for responsible security employers. It can result in suicide, but there are other issues, including family breakdown, addiction, and clearly job loss too, and also issues during the course of employment. So it needs to be addressed. Secondly, that there is help available, highly effective therapy, but it has to be the right kind of therapy, and that doesn't apply to all treatments. And thirdly, trauma awareness training for line managers is very useful, so that they can identify if and when there is a problem that arises. So I'm going to leave you at that point. Again, if people are looking for specific help from us as a charity, it's PTSD resolution. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick. Really appreciate that. So just before we hear from Sharon, just a reminder, if you get your questions in at the bottom on the question and answer panel at the bottom of your screen, as others have done already, we'll endeavour to get to you straight after we've heard from our final panellists. Sharon, your opening statement, please.
Hi, so my name is Sharon Mcdonald. My work is personal and professional, and I want to touch on a different part of suicide prevention, those bereaved by suicide. I have personally been bereaved by suicide, and it's the sole reason why I initially worked in this field. Just to put it in perspective, the economic cost of one suicide is 1.7 million. 70% of that is spent on caring for those bereaved by suicide. There's approximately 6,500 suicides registered in the UK annually. For every suicide, 135 people are affected. We know these are at risk of dying by suicide. These are the ones that you'll be finding that, you know, the bereaved coming to the first anniversary. You need to be mindful of this. So if you go with these statistics, around 877,000 people are profoundly affected by suicide and at risk of dying by suicide. So whoever is working in suicide prevention in a business, you need to look at suicide prevention of those that are suicidal, but please be mindful of those bereaved by suicide, because there's nearly 1 million people every year. It doesn't stop on the first anniversary. These people go back to work. They will be in your workplace. Some are too ashamed to divulge it. And, you know, you have a health and safety policy. What have you got in relation to bereavement, specifically suicide bereavement, when we know they're at risk?
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Excellent open statement. So a lot of issues there. Really good it's insights into this topic. And I know some of you have written to me in advance and said you're interested in this webinar because it's something you're not so familiar with. Let's go to Paul Vickery first, and perhaps I can come to you, Tim, as a starting point. And Tim, one of the questions is about the impact of COVID-19 on suicide rates, and what the impact likely to be, and what we need to look for. And maybe I could come to Doreen to get a United States view straight afterwards. Let me start off with you though, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Well, I guess the honest answer is that it's too early to say. We have no idea really in terms of what the full fallout will be. There are obviously a number of academics looking at this across both England and the world. The latest studies from England suggest that actually suicide rates have stayed relatively steady. There's no evidence yet of either a big increase or a big decrease. I think there are certain parts of the population which we are more concerned about than others. As we know, the coronavirus is one of those issues that we're all being impacted by, but in very different ways. So we are all in the same storm, but we've got very different ships and boats to sail in and try to find the course through. It's too early to say. And I think the big thing for England is that we've had quite a lot of economic protections built in through the government. And I think we're very concerned that when those economic protections start to be rolled back, that's where we could see more people getting into financial problems, redundancy, debt, housing, etc., which all exacerbates suicide risk.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I mean, Doreen, similar in the US or different?
Similar in that it's too early to tell. And similar to what Tim said, I think some early data shows that maybe we're not going to see an increase, but it is way too early to tell. And similar to what Tim said, we know different groups and different sectors have been disproportionately impacted by the virus. And I think we can assume that we may see differences in suicide rates within certain groups, but it is way too early to tell. The only thing I would add is that, we're influencing suicide in real time, meaning that we are still in the virus, right? We're still in this pandemic period, and the things we do today can really shape that trajectory, going forward, because, we're still in it. So, but it is way too early to tell.
Okay, thank you very much. Patrick, any reason to suppose that this is going to be more of an issue in the security sector than perhaps many others because of its engagement with the front line, and perhaps because when economic hardship does hit, if it hits, security is likely to take a hit on that too?
Well, you've almost answered the question there, Martin. Absolutely. Unfamiliar situations, security people asked to do things, perform tasks that they wouldn't normally do, like, for example, supervising queues, stopping people, asking them to leave the store or to put on a mask, for example. So there's that potential for confrontation and conflict, which is very stressful. So, as so often happens, unfortunately, for security operational staff, there's long periods of boredom interspersed with periods of confrontation and extreme stress. But also, too, they've got the same pressures, of course, that the rest of us have. So, and of course, many, unfortunately, are quite lowly paid. So they're going home to they've got the uncertainties of employment. They've got all the other problems that we have too. So yes, this is a particularly more stressful situation for those frontline staff in security than it would be prior to COVID.
Okay, interesting. Sharon, if I could come to you for a question for Peter Herwig. And as he said, suicide is a factor which you've all mentioned that a lot of people live with. And I guess his point is about the return back to the office and how we might begin to think about such cases. And I guess the thing is, Sharon, people have been away for a while now, and they're just beginning, at least, to talk about coming back, in some countries more than others. Do we need to think about this differently, Sharon?
Absolutely. Now, I can't talk about the COVID, but I can talk about suicide and people bereaved by suicide. I just, in November, we launched a report, 7,158 people bereaved by suicide, completed a 72-question survey, and 40% of those received some kind of support when they returned, but not fit for purpose. So just because you've got something in place doesn't mean it's right. So absolutely, HR departments don't know what to do. Health professionals struggle with these people. So I would say any business that is taking this seriously, you need to train your HR department. You need to have appropriate policies in place and self-care, not only for the clients or whoever or whoever you're protecting, but it starts with your staff. And what we find, if anyone's interested in this report, it's a shocking report that's generated national, international interest. Things have to change, yes.
And what, just very quickly, Sharon, why is that situation come about in the first place? It sounds as though it should dramatically bad.
Well, off the scale bad. And let me tell you, it doesn't get any better. I led this project for 5 years without any funding because we couldn't secure funding, even though it's a government priority. But this report is generating interest in Australia, America, Norway are considering doing it. So I know I'm beating the drum for people bereaved by suicide, but put in simple terms, it's like a conveyor belt. get upstream with these people, because if you don't, they've got the risk factors. They try to come to work, staff don't know, managers don't know what to say to them, so they say nothing, so they look like they don't care, and it's just a big cycle of negativity and risk factors. So, you know, if we can educate people, consider the needs of our staff and treat them appropriately. And it's not appropriate, this is what we found in this report, oh yes, we have a service where they can ring up and have an appointment. Is that what they want? Ask these people, because sometimes the solution's in the problem. Ask these people and they will tell you. And often, you know, they're not stupid staff. They know when it's a tick box exercise and when it's genuine. And even if you get it wrong, if it comes from a good place, they understand.
Okay, thank you very much. Dora, just come to you. You were nodding in the background about this return to work. It strikes me as an interesting question, actually, that I wouldn't know whether it's, I mean, is it more dangerous? I mean, are there extra things to look for, worry about, manage as a consequence of this change?
Well, we know that both the leaving work and now the return to work is stressful. It's more changes people are experiencing, and they may have had some thoughts about what return to work would look like, and it may look different than what they expected. You know, one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to is really looking for changes in behavior. So, you know, if you've been working with someone and they're returning to work and you're noticing, you know, they don't seem quite like themselves, or your gut is telling you there's something not quite usual here, that's a key signal to start asking some questions. You know, how are you doing? You seem a little overwhelmed, you know, and really listening and not being afraid to ask directly about suicide if you suspect that that may be what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I guess, is it the case you wouldn't ask direct? I mean, you'd ask about whether you feel overwhelmed, whether you're coping well. I mean, it'd just be quite a dramatic question to approach that subject direct, isn't it?
Well, I think ultimately you do want to ask directly, right? Because we know
Right.
distress can take many forms, and it doesn't always mean someone is suicidal. But I think sometimes it's helpful to have a softer lead in and to really get a sense, you know, to understand from this person's viewpoint what they're experiencing, whether it's overwhelm or frustration or sadness or loss. I mean, we know we have a hugely, the impact of loss during COVID can't be understated. So many people not only have lost their lives, but also just the losses around economic losses, job losses. I mean, the extent has been quite great. So, but you're right. So it can be hard. I think it's important that you ultimately ask directly, but you can lead in with other questions about how someone's doing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Tim, I'll come to you next. And Dennis Shep has got a question directly linked to your opening statement. And I thought it was an interesting statement, actually, Tim, when you mentioned about the use of technology and phones, because almost in the world of security, a theme running through these webinars has been, be careful of technology and your privacy and preying on what you're doing. So your idea was fascinating. Tim, your thoughts? Can you expand?
So I'm no technical expert, and I'm absolutely not going to take credit for the idea, but we've been approached. So in my position as a local authority, we've been approached by a couple of companies who believe that they've got a technological solution which may help in certain situations. So lots of caveats around it. We haven't tested it, but we're exploring about whether we can test them out. And what they are, they're little beacon-sized technological devices that you screw onto the wall of car parks or the entry walkways to bridges or what have you. And then anyone that it basically tracks any phone that goes past it, and it, while that phone is within its parameters, it can track behavior. So if, for instance, it can tell if somebody's got halfway across a bridge and then stops, or goes up to the top floor of a car park and then stops and doesn't move. And then it can send automatic signals back to presumably the security team, but it doesn't have to be, it could be anyone else, to consider either putting the CCTV cameras on them if that's a possibility, or go and do a physical check on them. So that must be possible. And as you say, there are ethical and data protection type issues to be resolved. However, I think there is, and I think this may be going back to one thing that has changed through the COVID pandemic. I think there's greater awareness now around mental health and the need to put some interventions into place. And I think that's, if there can be a positive to come out of COVID, I think the focus on mental health and emotional support is one of them. And actually, I think there is an appetite amongst certain agencies now to try and make sure that we can support. And if that means being a bit braver with data protection and the use of technology, then I think there might be an appetite for that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Tim. I'm going to move on because we have a lot I want to get through and a lot of questions coming in. Patrick, a question from you. I'm going to read you the question, and I'm going to ask Sharon afterwards to approach this from her side of things. The question is this: what can you suggest for managers where they can maintain a level of professional detachment yet be supportive, being able to be human yet walk away at the end of the day? Or is there no such thing? And there is that role of management here in overseeing so much. It's an interesting point about where you learn and how you approach this. Patrick first, then perhaps Sharon.
Absolutely. It needs training, quite simply. I mean, it's not the sort of skill that people would naturally have. I mean, a few exceptional people might have that sort of empathy and rapport. But just to pick up on Doreen's response earlier too, yes, issues need to be raised in certain situations. For example, one we're asked about is if there's an incident, heaven forbid, a bomb goes off or some other incident involving security people, if those people may be affected, that it may be appropriate to talk to them, to talk to them and have a conversation. But how do you broach a conversation like that? What do you say? Again, it requires training, which is why, without wishing to just plug our trauma awareness training for employees, it requires to understand how you can introduce the topic, ask a person the right sort of questions in the right sort of way, and then signpost suitable treatment. So one isn't seeking to train someone to become a psychologist or let alone a psychiatrist, but really to have a proper conversation with the person, but also to recognize symptoms, because so often security people won't say anything. One of the reasons is they don't want to lose their job, or they don't want a medical record stating that they've got mental health problems. So, and again, just to mention our service, a GP referral isn't required. So you need to be able to broach the subject with the reassurance for the person that you're speaking to that their issues will be dealt with compassionately and sympathetically and professionally too.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, from your side, a similar point about where you go.
Yeah, so it's a case of investment, training and education and support, empowering the workforce and managers. I want to signpost the listeners to a specific document. So I am about the suicide bereavement bit. Superb document written by businesses, and it's called Management in the Event of a Suicide, Postvention Toolkit for Employers. So this is written by business in the community. This book will guide businesses how to develop a service, but you've got to throw some money at it. It doesn't come with a wand. And, it's like anything. So it's kind of, that infrastructure's got to be in place. It shouldn't fall on one person, but at the very basic level, if they're educated and there's a protocol in place, because there's another issue that we've not discussed on here. What happens if somebody in the workplace dies by suicide? That is another issue that you've got to address, because those people that are attached to that person are also at risk. So if you don't deal with this because it's too difficult, you can lose your workforce through mental health problems or sickness. So it's a problem that won't go away, and you're best addressing this before it happens, because as I said to you, there's nearly 1 million people a year bereaved by suicide, and they will be working within your line of work.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that. Doreen, just on that point, and Sharon partly answered it, it's about someone who's involved in helping someone in an incident. Is there any suggestion that they themselves are more at risk of attempted suicide as a consequence of being directly involved in incidents?
Not so much, although we do know a few things. In terms of risk categories, those who have experienced a death by suicide are in a different risk category than those who haven't. So for example, if I lost someone close to me, I'm in a different risk category than if I never lost anyone close to me to suicide. But risk is kind of no one factor really explains risk. It's really a convergence of factors. And so, helpers certainly, as a result of being helpers, are not at higher risk, but they may have other risk factors. So, I think what Tim and Sharon both said earlier about learning and really understanding what risk factors are and what to look for, and certainly the presence of a mental health condition that particularly one that's untreated, is associated with suicide risk. So, but no one risk factor, I think, is the takeaway, should we focus on. We should really think about the bigger picture when understanding someone's suicide risk.
And just on that point, Doreen, a question from Gordon Knight. So working from home isn't in itself seen as I just wonder, because you're much more alone and isolated often, aren't you? There is this point about the office banter and being part of something. But as far as we know, there's no risk of that, Doreen?
Well, we know isolation can be a risk factor, but you can be in a group of people and still feel very isolated, right? So it's not only the being around other people, but it's also kind of the psychological experience of feeling isolated. But there are other risk factors. For example, things like substance use, changes in substance use can be a factor. The presence of trauma or having early childhood trauma can be a risk factor. Certainly, mental health conditions, there's a number of things that contribute to risk, including not having access to care or access to care that supports you or that adequately treats your health condition.
Okay, thank you very much. Question for Tim, and I'm going to come to you, Patrick. Tim, you work with a range of different organisations, and the question is about where you point people to go for help. So Mike Hurst's question is about where companies might go. And Chris Middleton's question is about in aftercare where we might point people to. So just on that general level, Tim, the sorts of places one may look to get advice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I guess the answer is in the same way that Doreen was saying about everyone's suicide risk is different. Well, actually, what would help is going to be different for everyone as well. So what I would suggest is making a range of different options available. For some people, having a really good, strong in-house occupational health team will be very appropriate. For other people, the services that kind of Patrick's already talked about will be very appropriate. Certainly within the general population of 1.8 million that I work with, we've produced two services or commissioned two services. So one is a 24-hour telephone helpline that's got trained counsellors at the end of the phone line any day, every day throughout the year, every night, 24 hours a day, free of charge. So people can always call that helpline whenever they need to. And as we know, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning is a very lonely time if you can't sleep and you've got things going on in your mind. The other service that we've recently commissioned is exactly the same principle, 24 hours open to anyone in the population. They can talk about anything, but instead of being a 24-hour phone line, it's a text service. So giving people that choice. We know middle-aged men don't particularly like talking about their emotions. Actually, they might feel better putting it in a text form, sending a text message off. We know that may also work better for younger people. We know that might work better for people who are being abused in their own household. So giving people that range of different ways of getting help is probably what I would suggest.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Patrick, I'm going to come to you. Patrick, can I include a very specific question? We had it in advance from Phil Papora, who's a consultant in the United States, very well known on the circuit. And Phil's point was about where you go to identify for when you're recruiting people and you're recruiting into these roles. Do you need to be extra careful because it is frontline work? And if you do, what's the process of being careful in terms of good practice and good thinking? Patrick?
Okay, again, it's really a similar sort of answer in the sense of having the training, the line managers and the HR people too, having some training in understanding how to identify trauma, people who have been traumatized, because of course they might already be traumatized from previous employment. They might have been in the armed forces and have some residual trauma from that. But it isn't a kind of one-off screening process. A lot of it is line managers getting to know their teams, getting to understand the normal behavior. And if, for example, there's an incident that occurs and the security operative may be traumatized from that, their behavior might start to change. There might be absenteeism. They might seem to be suffering from some sort of substance abuse, for example. So it can be difficult to calibrate behavior against kind of what is normal. But that again is why training is required, and also someone to ring up if there is an issue, or someone to direct a staff member to say, give them a ring, have a chat with them, see if they can help you. But there are sadly NHS treatments often are really not up to the task in this sort of incidents, because there's a long waiting time in getting treatment, and too often, from a recent survey that we did of veterans, too often tranquilizers are prescribed, medications are prescribed, rather than the sort of therapy that can actually help them to deal with the issues concerned and get better.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm kind of dawing with the next question. Sharon, I'd like your comments too. It's from Erica Gibbons, although Simon Cham has been mentioning some similar things. And it's a really interesting question, Doreen, for you. Why is suicide considered such a bad thing? Why is it taboo, perhaps, is the word? And in a way, the way you've all been talking is a very similar message that, being compassionate, being understanding, recognize the problem, identify the skill sets, know your staff, engage. Okay. Why is suicide taboo?
Well, I think it's an important question to address. And certainly I know Sharon will talk about the loss side of it and the impact on those left behind. But one of the things we know from interviewing people who have survived suicide attempts is that there's often suicidal crises happen in a moment for people. So they may have thoughts and never really have an impulse to act on those thoughts. But in the moment when they do act, it's usually because things have converged in a way where, as if those stressors weren't present, they wouldn't necessarily want to die by suicide. And I think the other thing that's really important, so when you ask people once they've had some distance from their attempt, many of them say, you know what, that seems almost unthinkable to me. So, it's about kind of helping people who are in a moment of crisis really weather that crisis, because we know that when they're feeling better or well, the thought of taking their life actually surprised many of them, and often feels like the last thing they would want to do. So, it's really about that. But I think the bigger picture on this really is to think about this as a health issue. We think of suicide differently, but it's really not. We place some judgment on, well, what's wrong with someone dying by suicide? Well, what's wrong with someone dying by a heart attack, right? We don't think of that in the same way. But we often feel how tragic when someone dies unexpectedly due to other circumstances. So, to me, the question kind of underscores the stigma we all feel around talking about mental health and treating it differently other than part of our overall health.
Yeah, interesting point. Sharon, let me come to you, same question. It's about the taboo issue and the sort of stigma, as Doreen mentioned.
It's steeped in history. In the 1800s, if you didn't manage to end your life, if you were attempted, you was condemned to death. 1961, it stopped being a crime. But let me tell you, it's like stigma's live and kicking, and we need to speak out. And the very fact that you're doing this webinar is a big deal, because the people are listening to you, and it's things like this where you're comfortable talking about this, asking us these questions that we can give answers, and then people can learn from that. And I'm hoping after today that some people will think about developing a suicide prevention strategy within the workforce.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I guess this thing is, though, Sharon, isn't it, that what was it take to make this subject less taboo? I mean, is there some dramatic sort of moment or awareness training or issue that we could do to, because it's a big deal, this point, that it's taboo and therefore problems result as a consequence?
So I'll give you an example. It's about, and it's sometimes when there's a complex problem, we think we have to have a complex solution. Well, it's not that complicated. It's about educating. So I remember when I was young, you used to call cancer, you didn't say cancer, it was the big C. and everyone, you just didn't say it. So you'd have someone in your family that's got the big C, and they were like lepers almost. Well, that's not like that now. And the reason is because we need to educate our workforce and society. And, you know, that takes investment and time and the will to do it. And things like what you're doing today, and I'll keep beating on about that, it's a big deal, because I don't know many that, like in your field, that would even dare do this, you know, to talk about it in this way and be challenging.
Thank you very much indeed. Patrick, I'll come to you because it sort of naturally leads to you, because it's something that you've been very involved with. And Kevin Fides, excuse me, Kevin, if I haven't pronounced your name right, talks about work with ex-servicemen. I know that's, Patrick, that work that you've done. But of course, we have got a very male-dominated industry here, which I guess, given to the statistics I think was mentioned earlier, it's men in particular that, although it can vary by circumstance. What's the issue, male, female, whatever, but gender, what's the issue about talking with people who come from that sort of stiff upper lip background, you know, that, and in the security sector has unfortunately got quite a macho image attached to it, which is his Achilles heel. What are the ways in which we need to to what extent breaking down that is a part of doing a good job in security? Patrick, very brief, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, it's all about awareness. It's about people, line managers being aware, informing their staff. We are the sort of company where you can come to us and talk to us if you have think you might have a mental health issue. That's the sort of message that needs to go out through companies. It's about colleagues caring about each other, line managers, but also families. The majority of service people we get coming to us is because a family member said, you've got a problem, you've got to speak to someone, and I've heard of this organization, why don't you give them a ring? So often not, that is the impetus. It's not just someone spontaneously thinking, I've got a problem, I'm going to pick up the phone and ring PTSD resolution. So it's all of us, and great work that you're doing today. It's through this kind of communication, spreading the word, for it to be discussed quite openly, in the way that we're doing, and in that way, that's the educational process and the process that will assist people and hopefully counter a lot of potentially suicidal situations for people.
Thank you very much indeed. Tim, just a very final question. I'm going to ask you to be very, very quick if you wouldn't mind. Could we, and it's Chris Middleton, could we mandate mental health training in the same way that we do first aid training? Isn't it just as important and just as a big deal? It's an interesting question. I suppose it's sort of yes or no, but yes or no, or in a few comments.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Many organisations already do. What I would say is that sometimes with mandatory training, it can become a bit of a tick box. So you just do it, you get it done and dusted, and so it has pros and cons. I would much more prefer to advocate that you engage with staff proactively, explain why this is important, and take them on a journey with you, rather than saying you have to do this, otherwise you're not going to get paid next week. I think it's much more better to create a culture where people want to do it and see the value of doing it. Okay,
thank you very much. Panel, we're coming to the last couple of minutes or so. So I'm going to ask you sort of 15 seconds each, which is a dramatically unfair for a massive question. You could wave a magic wand, one thing we should be doing as an industry, as a society, as a sector, that's going to make a most difference to responding in some way. What would you do with that magic wand? I mean it, 15 seconds, please. Sharon first.
I've just been commissioned to develop a suicide bereavement pack for the armed forces. Why haven't you got one for business?
Suicide bereavement pack. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Patrick.
Instill a company culture from the top downwards, that people know that if they have an issue, that it's going to be addressed sympathetically and compassionately and professionally too.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of you'd think that would be the done thing. Doreen.
I'd say recognize that you already have people in your midst that are struggling with suicide, and don't wait until you have an incident. Start now thinking about how to create a culture of care.
Okay, and Tim, finally with you.
Yeah, everything that everyone's already said. I get the beauty of saying that because I go last. But also, let's see what technology can do. Let's explore whether we can do a bit more and intervene right at the crisis point, as well as trying to prevent them for much further upstream.
Thank you very much indeed. Panel, thank you so much for your insights. We're out of time. Thank you to you, the audience, for your questions. Absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry I didn't get to every single question. There were so many, but and they were so diverse. I tried to cover them in different ways. What is crystal clear? Here's a subject that we need to embrace much more closely. the taboo and stigma issue is a real barrier to progress. I'm really sort of sensitive to what the panelists were saying, all of them in their different ways, where once again, we find that good business practice, good culture, good approaches, good leadership, good engagement with staff and stakeholders is good for business. It's also good for mental health. It's also good for suicide prevention. It's also good for making profits. There's a link there somewhere when it's good for security as well. Okay, I'm sure we'll return to this subject. A few final points from me. Just to let you know that the outstanding security performance entries closed in South Africa. You've only got a little bit of time now. You've got a few more days. Kenya and Romania, get onto those entries and find out who's the best. And the United States, the entries open soon. Stand by. We'll be telling you more in the upcoming webinars. Talking about coming webinars, we're back on Thursday, where the topic is the move to a cashless society, the societal and security implications of getting away with cash. Who cares? Isn't it unqualified good? Apparently not. We're going to be finding out the details on Thursday and look at the security implications. And next week, just to say to you, we've got one on the dark net and an offender's idea of paradise. We've got panelists discussing the dark net and the implications of security. And next Thursday, our 100th webinar, when we've got an ex-offender coming to talk to us, someone you haven't met before, who's going to be telling you why security is not very good because he defrauds and steals from companies for years and got away with it most of the time. He was caught eventually, mind you. We'll be speaking to him post-prison about his experience. So just to say thank you once again for the panel, for their insights and their advice. Thank you to you, the audience, for your questions. In the background, I just want to say a special thanks to my colleagues, Christine Brooks and Hannah Miller, and particularly Josephine Ram, who's a researcher on perpetuity, helped me put this together, and the panelists were her ideas. Didn't she make a good choice? So thank you very much indeed. Wherever you are in the world, I hope to see you again on Thursday, but wherever we do meet again, until then, stay safe.